All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
And welcome back to the second part of this incredibly interesting discussion we have today with Thornhill of the electrical universe theory. Now, in this second part, we've agreed to, we've seen a little, we just scratched the surface, obviously, about the nature of the electrical universe theory, but you touched a lot of essential and interesting aspects of it. Now, I want us to, in part two, see a little, you could have the question, a naive person could say, well, if you're onto it, why isn't this accepted? Why isn't this taught everywhere? Especially since you assert that this is fact-based and can be verified rather than falsified, etc. So what's the problem here?
It comes down to human behavior. We're not very well adapted to do science. And there was a book published, I think, about 1850 by a fellow called Charles Mackay called Extraordinary Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And in that, he points out some of the strange delusions that have gripped the globe in the past. And one of them being the Tulip Incident, where tulips you could only be bought if you could sort of mortgage your house for a single tulip.
Okay.
It was a kind of madness that gripped people.
That became currency?
Yeah, they became currency.
Jeez,
yeah.
Wow.
Back at some period in the 1800s, I think.
Sounds like a conspiracy launched by the tulips growers.
Yes, but in the book he gives a number of examples, and he points out that in those cases people come to their senses only slowly and one by one, and this is what I've discovered with presenting the electric universe. It is such a radical change, although the classical scientists of the 19th century would have taken to it, I'm sure, readily, because this is an extension of their work, if you like. But today we have a real problem, and that is that scientists are taught so narrowly. This idea of specialization actually works against them. It works against us in trying to advance science. I experienced it when I was working at the Australian National University, where even inside one department, many of the professors and scientists in that department had to have explained to them what their neighbour was doing down the corridor. So I would go to their meetings, and because of this disconnect, the scientists, when they were discussing their work, had to explain to this specialised audience what they were doing, even though they were in the same discipline.
Right.
So there's a disconnect, and this means that science is fragmented, and when you have a problem that you think somebody in another specialty can answer, you have to take their answer and accept it, because you have no means of distinguishing whether it makes sense or not, quite often. And this slows down progress enormously. So ever since Einstein and Niels Bohr destroyed physics and began doing mathematics, we then had the first, well, that was, about the time of the First World War. And part of the work that I began after reading Immanuel Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision, he was a trained psychoanalyst, a medical doctor, if you like, and also provided some breakthrough ideas in that subject. But he was really one of the original classical scholars. So he had a grasp of ancient history and all of the sciences and so on. And as a result, his book deals with all of these issues. He wrote Earth in Upheaval from the geological aspect. He wrote Ages in Chaos from the historical aspect. And one of his final books was called Mankind in Amnesia, which deals with the problems of humankind from the point of view of a revised catastrophic history. And it seems we're dogged by memories of the past which are subconscious almost, but they keep rising to the surface.
So we have collective PTSD.
Exactly. And we don't recognize it. And this is why we have these cycles of prosperity, and then, as one other scholar from the 1800s pointed out, we have this cycle where those in power find that they can raid the public purse, and it finally all falls apart and decays into nonsense and chaos. And then you have a dictatorship or some form of control, which then degenerates into battles and, civil uprisings and wars. And then after it's all over, people rejoice in the streets as if there's been some kind of catharsis. You've repeated the past. And of course, all the ancient stories about prophecy, an eventual catastrophe. And this is just a repeat of mankind's early experiences which have been suppressed. And Velikovsky said, unless we understand our past, we're doomed to keep repeating it. And he said the worry these days is that when we have these outbreaks of insanity, of war, we now have the ability to wreak the kind of destruction that the ancient catastrophes, the gods of the sky, the gods of the past, the planetary gods, visited on us, that is, with nuclear weapons. And of course, when Velikovsky wrote the book, the nuclear standoff was top of people's minds. And you'll notice that...
Wait a minute. Wasn't he active in the late 1800s?
No, Velikovsky was born in 1895.
Oh, so he was a contemporary with all the big ones.
With these people, yes, that's right.
I thought
In fact, he was actually on friendly terms with Einstein, who lived not far away in Princeton. And before Einstein died, relatively young, I should say, he was reading Velikovsky's work and also had a proposal to have Velikovsky's, one of his predictions tested, and that was to look for radio noises from Jupiter.
Wow.
In those days, they thought it was a cold ice giant, gaseous body, and they had no reason to expect radio waves, and yet it's the second most powerful radio source in the solar system after the sun. So this is typical of the kind of predictions that Velikovsky was able to make based on his reconstruction.
But that means that he was a contemporary with people like Keely, Reich, Tesla.
Yes.
Do you know if any of those people were interacting or looking at his theories?
No, I don't. Not that I know of.
Okay.
The people who became interested in his theories sort of clubbed together against the onslaught from the establishment, and kept his ideas alive. And this is how I came across the David Talbot and the people in Portland, Oregon, who published a university paper called Pensée back in the early 70s. I think started about 1972, and it culminated in 1974 with the International Velikovskyan Conference on the recent history of the solar system. But as I said, this classical approach of broad spectrum of training is essential, in my opinion, to do science.
Yeah.
Specialization is great if you're an engineer who's been given the science and the physics, and then you can go away and do the mathematics applied to these ideas and theories. But the person who's got to come up with the ideas needs to be a broad scholar.
Yeah. And that we've lost. It just gets worse and worse and worse.
It's getting worse and worse. And this is typical, of course, of human behavior, particularly of men. They form clubs, and so they form societies, and then they start, when they begin publishing, initially the publications are wide-ranging and people can get stuff published without being censored. But after a while, it doesn't take long, and I noticed this with the computer societies when I got into computing, was in the very early days.
Mm-hmm.
And if you found a clever way of doing something, you could publish the algorithms and so on, no trouble at all.
Mm.
And then in came the mathematicians. And all of a sudden you had papers which no one could understand because they'd gone off into esoterics, which sometimes is useful, but generally the people who were doing the engineering work on the ground ignored it because it was no relevance to them.
Because they have to relate to actual facts, right?
They have to make
tangible stuff.
They have to make things work, and I was one of the ones who had to make things work.
Right.
And my training in computing was privileged because I was in the very early days, and I got to learn everything from the hardware, the electronics, right up through compilers and operating systems, the works, which was wonderful. So I had a happy working life, but I kept out of academia and did the research on the side. And one of the things I found the most difficult to do was to drop the things I'd been taught, because you're suddenly faced with this problem of being an outcast, you know. How can I tell people that Einstein got it wrong and not appear to be completely out of my tree? Well, the answer is that when you look at the dissident scientists, there's a huge number of them out there, but you don't hear about them because their work is censored.
Yeah, they don't have access to those who control the tools of power, keep them out.
Yes.
And for all we know, and if you value you were lucky and were outside of academia, but if you value your career, you better be in lockstep. So
That's right.
We don't know if the majority actually may be dissidents. We can't know that. I'm not saying everybody is subscribing to one and the same rebel approach, but there may be scattered dissidents all over the place, and there's no way to pick that up.
Yeah, there is a scientist in France, Jean de Clément, who's published a compendium of all the dissident scientists that he could find and a brief synopsis of what they've got to say, and it runs for well over 1,000 pages.
And that's those who were willing to be on the book?
Yes.
Because most of them are probably rather silent or only talk off record, you know?
I know of quite a few scientists who support our work but can't do anything. They can't come out, so to speak. This is not the way science is supposed to be done. It's supposed to be...
but it's a brilliant recipe for a Vatican, for a Catholic organization.
Well, of course, the Catholic organization endorse the Big Bang Theory. Why wouldn't they? It's religion.
Right.
In fact, it was a Belgian priest who came up with the idea of the Big Bang.
Interesting.
Anyway, that's the other aspect, is human behavior. And it's my opinion that scientists should be taught human psychology. It should be a necessary subject to get their degree, because there is a fellow who's achieved quite a deal of fame or notoriety in England recently, has studied the behavior of learning and its relationship to the dual nature of the brain, the two hemispheres. And he pointed out that the study of left and right brain became sort of discredited when the New Age people took over, and so it became a sort of a taboo topic for psychologists. But he did a meta-study of all of the research that had been done on the divided brain and has published some books on it. And I came across his work just a couple of years ago, and I wrote to him because I also sent some papers which supported his views, research that had been done into the brain response to questions to physicists about mathematics and so on. And it showed that one hemisphere lit up preferentially in those people, the left hemisphere. And this psychologist pointed out that the left hemisphere is the survival hemisphere. It's the one that responds in order to survive. So what are we doing? We're training our scientists to always deflect questions, technical questions, to the left hemisphere to do the mechanical process of mathematics. You follow the rules. Mathematics is a set of rules like any game, like three-dimensional chess. So the ability to do mathematics has nothing necessarily to do with the invention of ideas as a physicist, the inductive approach. Anyway, so his research pointed out that the way people are trained leads them to be functionally blind to alternatives. They actually can't see what's in front of them. And it's quite marked.
It's a self-censoring, self-filtering away everything that threats.
Well, you're not even censoring. The brain is doing it automatically because of the way it's been trained. You're actually blind to it, which is quite remarkable. So I don't get upset when an expert tells me that I can't see what I'm doing when I know that he's the one who's got the problem with seeing what's in front of him. It's just the way we're built. And our scientists should be aware of this. They should know their limitations. Instead of that, we get people with more hubris than sense.
Yeah, this is very apparent in the so-called soft sciences, because those doesn't have to touch base with reality. They can go off on tangents and never come back. Yeah. But people believe that hard sciences is directly tied to fact-based circumstances.
Yes.
So how can this even creep into hard science?
Well, the reason is that mathematicians, because they can produce a so-called proof, which is watertight, using the mathematical rules, that can give them access to the secrets of the universe and the mind of God, for God's sake, through their mathematics. What they don't understand is that unless they have physically defined every symbol, including the operators, on that blackboard they have a habit of standing in front of to show they're geniuses, they don't know what they're talking about. All they're doing is showing that they can do mathematics. And even then they get it wrong, because there is an Australian fellow, Stephen Crothers, who's active in our group and speaks at our conferences, and he's pointed out that even Einstein didn't understand his mathematics, because in his theory of gravitation, his general theory of relativity, there is a pseudo-tensor. And that pseudo-tensor, when it was first defined, was pointed out it is non-physical. In other words, it has no meaning physically. So he said, in other words, that equation involves gobbledygook. Now, this is pretty serious.
It is.
Because, of course, that is one of the methods used by secret societies of maintaining their secrecy, is to confuse people with their insider knowledge. And you haven't got it, so keep out. You don't know what you're talking about.
Sectarian behavior.
Yes. And where in fact the reverse is the case. They don't know what they're talking about because they haven't defined simple things like energy and mass, and they don't understand light. So when they talk about the speed of light, they don't know what they're talking about. All of these things are critical to doing science, and the classical physicists knew this, and they were very good experimenters, almost to a man. Today, the scientists sit in a hall of mirrors in front of computer screens, all reflecting the same, when they say in computing garbage in equals garbage out, that's exactly what you get. You put your preconceived ideas into your algorithms, and out comes what you hope to see. So it's virtual reality. The other thing you'll notice is that universities these days have a media department, so that science is done by media release. And any journalist who actually questions these media releases is suddenly out of a job, because they're not following the party line.
You see that especially in the climate change phenomenon.
Oh, exactly.
If it's anthropogenic or not. and
that's another. Yeah, you can understand that psychologically. That's the funny thing. In this PTSD, there is this dreadful need to somehow revisit, but in a safe way, the catastrophes of the past, which we thought was the end of the world. It was doomsday. Well, we've got to have our doomsday scenario always lurking in the background. So when I was growing up, we had the nuclear winter, and then we had an ice age was going to come. That was back in the 80s or 90s. And then we were going to have an asteroid hit us or a comet.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we've had the space watch set up. And now we've got anthropogenic global warming. Well, they've stopped talking about anthropogenic global warming, and it's just become climate change.
Climate change, yes.
But the climate changes. We have to get used to that. The only good thing that can come out of all of this is maybe we might clean up our act a bit, because we have a dreadful nature, which not only do we destroy each other on occasions, but we're happy to destroy the environment that we depend upon. And the electric universe hopes to achieve that by pointing out that we are earthlings. We are connected to this planet in more ways than we know. And by saying that we can colonize Mars and everything will be fine, give up. You go to Mars, you'll become Martians, whatever they are. Because all matter resonances are involved in biological systems. Life will exist wherever it is possible to exist, given the right circumstances, but it may be quite different to what we experience here on Earth right now. In fact, we know from the fossil record that before these catastrophes, quite different animals existed on the Earth, like the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs could not exist in today's conditions.
No, the climate was completely different. The air, everything.
They would not be able to lift themselves off the ground, and also the atmosphere had more oxygen in it in those days.
And we even tied in consciousness the Schumann resonance, or whatever it's called. Schumann frequency seems to be connected.
Yes, that's all part of biology.
Yeah, but then you go, okay, so we can say... I totally get what you're saying about understanding the motivation they have. It's not, it's not evil. The conspiracy can often be subconscious, but that's not enough, because then, the naive people who believe in scientism, you could call it, they would say, but if this is true, then what about they could just publish the studies and they could peer review it, and then it would force a paradigm shift, this romantic notion that when the new people come into the system, they will push out the old. So why don't you just peer review it and then everything will take care of itself? What's the problem there?
Well, the problem is you have no peers when you're doing the electric universe. No one has been trained to think like this. It requires a real multidisciplinary approach to science, which is not taught in any university. They talk about interdisciplinary cooperation, but they really don't know the full extent of what an interdisciplinary approach is, because no one has ever considered the life, the universe, and everything as a fit place for a single study.
Yeah, but that's one thing. But what I was getting at was the tools of suppression. People don't see them.
No, that's right.
People think that science is like a democratic free-for-all.
Yes, it's not at all. In fact, the politics of inside universities goes unreported generally. And I know a lot of people who've been damaged by the nasty politics inside universities. So if you step out of line, your life isn't worth living in those environments, because it is very controlled.
But what is the control mechanism? Obviously, it supports the status quo. But do you think it's more tied to ideology, or do you think it's more tied to more practical interests like power and money and God knows what, military?
Yeah, the people who are in science generally, their ideas become them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Their ego is tied up with their ideas, because as a scientist, of course, you'd like to be recognized for introducing something new, some new idea. And of course, they offer prizes, the Nobel Prize, quite lucrative, some of them. for managing to discover something. So one of the misguided efforts in science is to invent a new particle or a new energy or this kind of thing. That is diametrically opposed to the classical science approach, which was to simplify, reduce the number of particles that you need to explain something, reduce all of these imaginary forces.
But people believe that they don't understand that these things are imaginary. People think that it's a matter of proof, it's a matter of tangible evidence that these things exist. But you dispute that.
Well, the difficulty is that in the media, a lot of so-called facts are not facts at all. They're merely hypotheses, which are held by all of those around them, and so they can write it down as a fact and not be called to account for doing so.
Yeah, this is where Sheldrake has he smashed in the doors with the science delusion book.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
He shows that the big dogmas of science are actually hypotheses.
Yes, and a lot of them don't stand up to any rational analysis anyway, which is really sad when you think about it, because we're not training kids in school to look at alternatives and to decide which one they favour before they're told what others believe. Yeah. And belief is a strong word in science. It's the underlying characteristic of it.
And that's critical, that's essential for critical thinking. If they don't learn that, they won't become critical thinkers.
Yes. I remember when I was in high school, in the final year or two, one of the subjects in English was critical thinking, clear thinking. And we were handed articles to read, and we had to look at the types of arguments that were being used and whether it stood up to
scrutiny,
critical examination, or whether it was full of holes. And I found that one of the most interesting aspects of English was the use of words to convince somebody of something that just wasn't so.
Yeah.
And I think this has been, when I scan scientific literature, I'm looking for things that are wrong, either stated incorrectly or are using concepts that are nowhere defined. And that narrows down my search for answers considerably. But peer review certainly has turned into a censorship system. I got a paper published on the electrical nature of supernova, 1987A, and its relevance to the electrical nature of stars by the IEEE journal on plasma science, which is a well-respected and peer-reviewed journal. I would never have got that published in any astronomical journal or astrophysics journal, simply because the astrophysicists believe that electricity does nothing in space. So this gives you...
So the preconceived notion makes them dismiss studies, even if these studies can show that...
Yes. Yeah, so we can show experimentally that what we're saying is correct. And this was borne out particularly by our own Sapphire Experiment, which is being done at arm's length from me. All I did was to provide...
Yeah, talk about that. Explain what that is.
Yeah. A few years back, I had an engineer from Canada ring me out of the blue, and he said... my very successful engineering business has gone bust due to the GFC. He said, I'm sitting here wondering what to do next. And he said, I came across your work. And he said, your model of stars, he said, I can see no disparities in it. And he said, that's a first in my experience. He said, usually when I'm presented with a problem in engineering, I can see some disparity in what's being asked, what's being proposed, which would defeat any attempt at engineering it. So he said, is there anything I can do to help? And I said, it certainly sounds like it. So I put him in touch with our management team in the US. And the result of that has been the setup of a private experiment funded by benefactors who believe in what we're doing, to the tune of several $1 million.
Jeez, wow.
And we have produced what you might call a star in a jar, although the jar is 4 feet in diameter and 8 foot long and made of steel. And the results that have been coming back have shown that we can reproduce the plasma conditions we see around the sun. We can explain the solar wind, the granulation appearance of the photosphere of the sun, and we're now investigating nuclear reactions in the photosphere and not in the center of the star. So,
well, what about auroras? Can that be explained?
Well, Christian Birkeland, who was from Norway, I believe, was one of the leading scholars that we point to as a precursor of the electric universe, because he was the one who said that the space between us and the sun must be filled with charged particles. And that was back in 1900, long before the space shots surprised astronomers with the strength of the magnetic field up there, and there's charged particles whizzing around everywhere with the Van Allen belts. All of this was a total surprise to them, but Birkeland, back in his publications in the polar expedition and also his experiment, he did an electrical experiment called the Terrella, or Little Earth, where he put a magnetized metallic sphere inside a vacuum chamber and passed DC electricity through that vacuum and managed to produce in that little experiment, replicate the auroras. He was able to show ring formations, equatorial ring formations like the rings of Saturn, and the migration of discharges like the sunspots on the sun.
Wow, when was this, you say?
It was published in 1900, his book.
That long ago, yeah. So it's been a mystery for all this time for no reason at all.
Yes. But of course, once again, politics and what would you call it, parochialism in science, where the British dominated Western science. Sidney Chapman, I think it was, had developed a theoretical explanation for charged particles bumping around and causing the auroras. It was a purely sort of electromechanical idea that the solar wind buffeted the Earth's magnetosphere, and the buffeting, the mechanical action, generated the auroras. But Birkeland already had twigged in 1900. And in fact, Chapman was aware of Birkeland's stuff, but he just dismissed it because it wasn't invented here, so to speak.
Jeez.
It seems. But
so even chauvinism is a part of their bias.
It's terrible. Yeah, terrible. He was given the opportunity to witness Birkeland's experiments, I believe. In fact, there's a book by Lucy Jago, what's it called, who documented Birkeland's problems. Yeah, it's called The Northern Lights, How One Man Sacrificed Love, Happiness and Sanity to Unlock the Secrets of Space. And that's a book worth reading. And this, of course, is why Hans Alfvén pointed to the fact that cosmologists should visit Scandinavia to witness the aurora before they start making pronouncements.
Well, don't you have auroras down there too?
Yes, we do. Tasmania sees more than we do. We're a bit further north. But on occasions...
But it's the same principle, right?
Same principle, yes. The electric currents always follow the magnetic field lines because that's called the force-free. There's no force acting on the particles to deflect them, so they'll follow the magnetic field lines.
But why is it green in the north and pink in the south?
It all depends on the level of the atmosphere and the atomic species that are being excited. So there's both the energetics of the aurora are involved and the atmosphere, the particles in the atmosphere. The motion of the aurora follows all the plasma physics rules, but these are all a mystery to the astrophysicists at the time. It was all a surprise, what you see as perpetual surprises for astrophysics. And one of the reasons for that is that they treat plasma as a magnetized gas, which is incorrect. Now, Hans Alfvén did something unprecedented. In his Nobel Prize lecture in 1970, he warned of a astrophysics crisis, which must happen because astrophysicists had just chosen to adopt this magnetized gas idea of plasma. And he said, if you ignore the electric circuits in plasma, then you have missed the fundamental aspect of all of this activity in space. And of course, they've continued to ignore it. But to do such a thing, to admit you made a mistake in a Nobel Prize acceptance speech is, I think, unprecedented. But he was very concerned that so much time and effort was being wasted and that a crisis would occur where they'd have to give up that model, the magneto-hydrodynamic model of plasma.
I see. So, okay, but back to the problem of academia here. So you're calling it a censorship machinery. But then the question is, who is in control? And how can they maintain this control? What about the concept of paradigm shift? Shouldn't that kick in?
The paradigm shift is a revolution, and the people who are in power will not submit readily. It requires a revolution. So I realized that long ago. In fact, getting out of academia was one aspect of that. The other one was that I realized that I had to share my ideas freely and attract leaders in different fields. Because this is a multidisciplinary approach, one person can't do all the work. I realized it was impossible. So I've always shared my ideas and new insights as they occurred. And they're still occurring now, which is wonderful. And people who have an interest in some aspect of it, it can be geology, it can be historical aspects, sociology, human behavior, anything. Anyone who has an interest in these things, I'm happy for them to take the lead. In other words, if you lead, other people will be inspired to step forward and lead also. And this is what's happened.
Right. You're deliberately trying to remove ego from the equation in order, because
Yes.
you see how that's ruining mainstream.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is one of the pitfalls for independent scientists, and I see it all the time. They get very proprietorial about their ideas, and that stifles any chance of collaborating with others. And of course, to be a leader, you've got to stand up and say what you think, and then convince others that it's worth getting involved, maybe taking up leadership in some form. So
science has to be open source, basically.
Yes, exactly. So I'm not proprietorial at all about these ideas. In fact, I've never felt really threatened by somebody wanting to claim that they were the originator of the idea, because I realize that no one has covered the ground that I have. Being the boundary rider of science means that I've attempted to think about the implications of this work in any field you like to mention. And that has been, I think, a saving grace for me. Having had that realization and following that path has brought people, amazing people, forward to get involved. And we have one chap who's working on the electrical sculpting of planets, because part of the reconstruction and Velikovsky's work showed that thunderbolts of the gods meant something different from just plain old lightning. You can see the difference in the sculpting by early sculptors of Zeus and his thunderbolt. That thunderbolt looks nothing like the Shazam, the forked lightning picture that people are fond of. It has a complex shape. And that complex shape is precisely the form that plasma takes when it is moving through space as a coherent object, and it's called a plasmoid. And one of my favorite representations is the Tibetan Dorje, their thunderbolt.
Mm-hmm. So that's a thunderbolt.
And you can see that it almost looks like it's got a handle that you could hold.
Yeah.
And then it's got two often twisted ends, so it's symmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the form of the plasmoid. And you'll see the Greek sculptors also had that kind of football-shaped corkscrew that he's hurling. The representations of what was seen in the sky are everywhere, in our buildings, our religious icons and paintings and all of this kind of thing. It's like the subconscious drives artists to represent the things, the archetypes. And this is something...
Yeah, it's archetypal. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and this is something that Carl Jung picked up on. Now, he was a great scientist too, one who examined thousands of mentally disturbed people where the psychoses often resulted in the archetypes surfacing. And so towards the end of his life, he began painting himself what he had seen or understood from these archetypes. And there they are. There's the imagery. But he also pointed out that he began to realize that mankind is kind of slightly insane. And the post-traumatic stress disorder makes people this way. And it is destructive. And he said mankind is his own worst enemy. And that is the message from Velikovsky as well, who came at it from a different angle, but was also trained in psychoanalysis.
I can see, I can see why you guys are emphasizing the catastrophism, because if, in Jung's terminology, if we are held in this PTSD, then the only cure is to face the shadow. And in order to face the shadow, we have to accept the trauma.
Yes.
And that's not possible. That's what they're trying to avoid with this uniformitarianism madness.
Absolutely, yes. And the clockwork solar system and the Big Bang and everything is slow and billions of years ago. Anything bad that happened was a long time ago and far away.
Yeah. The go back to sleep approach, you can call it.
That's right. That is sheer nonsense. When you think about it, to say that Darwin's theory of evolution works, it doesn't, because in the fossil record shows it doesn't.
Yeah.
It is sudden, it is drastic. Whole species of animals wiped out globally, and then they're replaced with different ones, which gives you also hope for the future, and that means that life exists in the universe to fit the environment that it finds itself in. The information for the embryogenesis does not exist inside the cell. The cell merely receives the instructions and away it goes, and the information is available throughout the universe for life.
That sounds like there were two people who actually launched these things, but for some reason, and I guess I understand that reason, because Darwin is more in line with the current status quo, but they went with Darwin. But Wallace sounds like he would have been easier to resonate with electrical universe theory, his findings.
Oh, there were plenty of scientists back in those days who would have resonated with it. The Frenchman Georges Cuvier, he said, if you go into the countryside with a spade and turn over the earth, what you will see is evidence of paroxysms in the past, paroxysms of the earth. So he was a catastrophist in geology. And we have a fellow now, Andrew Hall, in the US, who will be speaking at our UK conference, by the way, who has almost an intuitive sense with his training of the effects of electrical sculpting of surfaces with arcs and also with supersonic blasts. I mean, the discharges between planets are something which is totally outside our experience, and yet the archetypes that we use in religion and so on are actually depicting what plasma looks like in space during an interplanetary discharge. It's quite amazing.
But what is plasma?
Plasma, yes. This is one of the stumbling blocks that we have with the electric universe, and that is that we don't have any day-to-day experience of plasma, which is separated charged particles moving with respect to one another. We see it in lightning. It is in effect in a flame, because there's enough energy in the heat of the flame to dissociate some of the atoms into electrons and ions, which then radiate on recombination to produce the light of the fire. Now, plasma is merely the case where there's sufficient energy to strip an electron or two off the atoms that are usually in a gaseous state, because as you increase the energy in a system, first the liquids boil and become a gas, and then the metals melt and then they boil and become a gas. That gas is made up of the free atoms and molecules from the material that's just evaporated. If you continue to apply more energy, then electrons become stripped from individual atoms, and then you have what is a very thin gas, if you like, but it is composed of freely moving charged particles, positive and negative, and it responds very powerfully to electric and magnetic forces. And that is plasma. So plasma behaves not as a magnetized gas, but as the particles moving in an electric discharge, for instance, like an arc welding, in lightning, in the aurora, where the gas becomes more or less dense. The discharge changes from an arc to a glow, and where it's less dense again, the electric current flows without actually giving any visible light, but producing radio waves. And so radio telescopes are very important in charting the directions of magnetic fields, which gives you the directions of electric currents in space near the sun. And of course, in recent years, scientists have been puzzled to find that nearby stars seem to be connected by these magnetic fields. Well, surprise, surprise, it's an electric universe, and the galaxy is driven by electric currents flowing between stars towards the center of the galaxy.
But if the Doppler effect is rubbish, how can they know anything about distant stars?
Good question. The Doppler effect isn't rubbish. I mean, that does work, but it's only in a very limited sense. And you can't assume that the high redshifts that we see from other galaxies, or a blue shift in the case of Andromeda Galaxy, has anything to do with movement away from or towards us. And Heltenarp has proved that the bulk of the high redshift in quasars and so on is quantized, and therefore due to the matter inside that object, not to its motion away from us. In the case of the Andromeda Galaxy, of course, the popular media story is that Andromeda is blue shifted because it's coming towards us, and in a few million years it'll, or some long period in the future, we'll collide with Andromeda. Well, that's rubbish.
That's not. Is that possible in an electrical universe theory?
No.
I thought that sounded fishy.
No, in the electric universe, as Heltenarp pointed out, that celestial objects operate with repulsive gravity, so they avoid collision.
And exactly. So it becomes a self-regulating cosmos. Yeah. Now,
in the case of Andromeda, the blue shift indicates that it is older than us. We're more redshifted than it, so it is older. We're younger. And that's all it indicates. It's not going to collide with us. In fact, our picture of the universe changes dramatically when you get rid of that concept that redshift determines distance. And the thing that students are not taught, and they should be taught, is that Hubble said there were two options for his discovery of the redshift distance relationship, and I think that's what he called it, a relationship. He didn't say it meant anything. He said is either the universe is much smaller, I think it was, than anyone thought, or some new physics is involved. And to his dying day, he did not think the expanding universe was correct. He thought that some new physics was involved. And of course, Heltenarp, one of his students, or one who worked with him, was the one who uncovered that fact that it involved new physics. The notion that protons and electrons can have varying mass during their lifetime depending upon their environment. The environment determines the mass of fundamental particles.
But okay, so let's rewind this now to the human condition. So we have a self-maintaining system of censorship, but who are these people who are in control? I mean, they will die off sooner or later. How can this the dismissal be maintained decades after decades after decades? What's the particulars here? How does this work? Because most people aren't in academia. They don't see these invisible power.
Yes. My own view is that looking back at history, and of course, if you want to avoid repeating mistakes, you examine history closely. You realize that Einstein's theory came about at a time of turmoil. The First World War, where the entire Western world went insane. I mean, the behavior is insane. There's no other word for it.
It's like we are perpetuating the trauma.
We are
to each other.
Yes, yes. It's a PTSD on a large scale, on a global scale.
And let's make many unnecessary wars just in case some people are getting out of the trauma. Let's induce more trauma. And if we are a collective, if we're connected, then it doesn't matter that the wars are taking place in the Middle East or whatever, because they will have an effect on everyone.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. Continue.
Yes. Well, one of the things that happens after this cycle of madness is that you come out the other side feeling a kind of catharsis.
Right.
And that's why people rejoiced in the streets and all that kind of thing. Well, the acceptance of Einstein's theory was due to Eddington. Eddington was a Quaker and a conscientious objector in the First World War, and was could have been a target for the white feather, as they called it. People who were, it was a symbol of cowardice. Now, Eddington, after the war, sort of had to re-establish his credibility, I think, and felt that he had to do that. Now, he was a mathematician. He was one who had the audacity to say that it shouldn't be too difficult to work out something as simple as a star. Yeah, well, unfortunately, his simple idea of what a star is incorrect, and yet it still is the basis of modern stellar theory. Now, he also was arrogant, intellectually arrogant, and was one who claimed that he was the only one. Perhaps there was one other, but he didn't know who that was, who understood Einstein's theory. Well, anyone who claims to understand Einstein's theory of relativity doesn't understand anything. It's probably the most read theory and the least understood of any in history, simply because it doesn't make any sense. It's removed all standards of measurement and made every observer equivalent, which is nonsense. Anyway, so and the fact that Einstein was accepted was a kind of a rebound from the madness of a war. And I'm a little worried that the acceptance of a completely new idea like ours, like the electric universe, will require a revolution. And I'm just hoping it doesn't include war. But it requires people looking for new answers. And of course, there are many people now looking for new answers and are dismissing expert opinion simply because it's getting more and more outrageous.
But this is happening more outside academia than inside?
Oh, even inside now. People are calling into question.
So science is slowly opening up?
That's what I said. Charles Mackay said, after the madness, people come to their senses slowly, one by one. It's not a sudden thing, and you have to reach a critical mass before, or some great demonstration. Now, our Sapphire experiment, I think, is that scientific demonstration. I'm just hoping that it's a very difficult thing to manage. It's almost like you need to have a strategy for how do you let this idea be released in such a way that it won't stop everything we're doing and have us, dealt with.
Yeah, you guys need your own media department.
Well, in some senses we have with the Thunderbolts project and also our annual meetings, conferences, and the huge amount of material we already have on the web. This is a kind of insurance policy from my point of view.
Right.
We don't want these ideas lost, so we sort of, with hundreds of hours of videos, we have 150,000 subscribers and over 13 million, probably 14 million views of our videos. So
it's bound to, so young people, students, people who have not got their paradigm crystallized,
yes.
fossilized
I
yet.
I get emails from students and even PhD students asking where they can study the electric universe. And unfortunately,
have you considered putting up schools?
We did so many years ago. I'm glad we didn't, because I'm allowing my intuition to guide me, because I have no idea how it's going to work. I just do what I feel is necessary at any given moment to try and establish more and more people understanding what we're doing, and understanding that there is a different answer which has hope for the future, something that Big Bang Theory offers none of, and also an understanding which brings us together instead of separates us.
But couldn't you get people, who controls what can be published, what can be peer-reviewed? That has to be, it's human beings, right? Is it possible to get someone into those positions?
Well, let me tell you what intuitively I think there. And my feeling has been that if we can convince somebody to bankroll an IMAX movie of what happened, showing all of the archetypal symbols as they were when they were observed, it'll tie the subconscious, it'll bring the subconscious to consciousness, and people will suddenly begin to understand that the divisions we create, the problems we face are universal, and we have to recognize that we are all connected, both individual to individual, but us to the earth, and that we must take care of it, and our future relies on us acting rationally, understanding our terrible past and healing from it. And we can't heal from it until we have these understandings.
But can't you get some of your people into positions where they can execute some influence, like what's peer-reviewed, what's studied?
No. In fact, long ago I decided that it was not worth playing academia silly games, because no matter how hard you try, they will shift the goalposts. They control the game. They make up the rules. So it's a waste of time playing those games.
So academia functions to a large degree because we can all see it displayed in public discourse when it comes to the pseudo-skepticists, the skeptics.
That's right, yes. That's right.
So it's the same way academia works as they work?
Well, the pseudo-skeptics are more or less the front line. As long as they're doing their job as far as the establishment's concerned, their first thing they will do is ignore us. And according to educational psychologists here in Australia, who've developed a very excellent school system to help students break bad habits, has pointed out the first behaviour when you're confronted with an alternative idea that goes against your habitual ideas is to deny it. And this is why you see the word denial creeping up
that's amazing.
In science, particularly by pseudo-skeptics. You're a denier if you don't believe what we believe in. Well, this is just religious nonsense. Because to say you deny something means you're the only one who knows the truth, which is a claim that no one can make.
It's completely unscientific because it implies belief, faith.
That's right. And so the first thing that the establishment will do is to deny anything we say or anything we try to publish in an accepted journal. The next thing is that this blindness that's created by the brain, the way our brain works, acts to instantly forget what it is that doesn't fit their pattern. Now, you can see this even with their standard research, because often you'll see, we're surprised to discover so-and-so, and yet I know that they've already discovered it 20 years ago, and it was a surprise then, and they haven't dealt with it.
So it's like you can see it in political discourse too. You ask your opponent a question, the question is answered, and then they completely ignore it, like
that's right.
They didn't answer that, and they move on with. So it's not a communication, it's not a transference of information.
Yeah, the problem occurs in science as well, that a politician will not answer the question, they'll answer the question that they would like to answer. And this is what happened when I was at university, what you would get is a rehash of what you already know they believe, but it's not answering your question.
Right. I get your point. It's very valid. And another phenomenon is that you answer the question and they behave as you never answered it. They're not addressing what you actually said.
Yes.
I guess that's going on a lot here, because if you're fact-based, and let's say because the first phase is ignore you, reject you, deny you. Yes. The second phase is to fight you.
That's right.
But they can't put up a fair fight, because then they would lose, right? So they have to. They have to. I've seen this in so-called skeptics. They just ignore. They just pretend you didn't address it, and they move on with the rhetorics.
Oh yes,
as if you never said it, right?
Yes, I had that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I used to deal with skeptics by one in particular who had access to NASA's libraries, and all he would do is do a library search on papers that referred to the same topic, and then just hit me with a whole raft of those. In his blog, and say, here's all these people who would say otherwise, and I go and look at the papers and I find out no, they didn't say otherwise. Often they were puzzled and said so.
Right. And even if they did, that would just be appeal to authority.
Of course, yes.
Which isn't an argument at all.
No, and one of the difficulties you have then talking to people who think they have the answers these days, which is often university students who think that now they've gone to university, they know it all.
They know everything.
You can see in their eyes that when you say something to them, that they're already just piling up objections without actually listening to you.
Exactly.
So at some point they stop listening, and you're wasting your time.
Yeah. That was my point about the question. Yeah, that is what you see in religious fanatics too.
Of course. Yes, they know the truth, and you don't.
And so we have a system that breeds new gatekeepers, basically, to take over.
The system that science operates now is big science, where it's institutionalized and it depends on government funding.
Right.
That works absolutely to kill innovation. Because then you have people climbing over each other to try and get the money. In fact, this is one of the problems that academics face these days. If they get to a position of professorship and that, they spend more time trying to get funding than they do actually thinking about their research.
Just like politicians, they can't do anything because they have to campaign all the time and get more money to maintain their position.
Or they have to behave as their party whips, or you have to toe the line. It really.
So you would say that economic because back in the 60s there was a lot of money going around, but now it's the profit aspect of science has taken over, haven't it?
Oh yes, and the universities have become businesses rather than research schools and ones who are actually doing something useful. In fact, there was a study done a few years ago which looked at government-funded research compared with privately funded research, like the Bell Labs and people like that, IBM and so on in America. And they said that the return on publicly funded research is hard to demonstrate compared with that of private industry, because in private industry you have competition of ideas. In government-funded research, the people who control the politics control the purse strings, and only that research that conforms to what the juggernaut of institutionalized science recognizes gets done. So there's only money spent on Big Bang research, none on plasmology.
Yeah, but I can see another problem here, and that's that I'm all for private research, but if you're talking about corporations, it's pretty easy. Here's the money. Here's what we want to achieve. Now you go do it. That means that it's not like an open, explore and find the truth. It's more like get to the goal of our agenda.
Of course.
And if you can't, we'll replace you with someone who can. So the traditional...
There is some of that, but also places like Bell Research and IBM, I know, did fundamental research at the same time.
Okay.
They didn't dismiss it.
Yeah, because the traditional argument is that if you have a publicly funded science, then they will not have these specific agendas reach this goal. It's more like, we can sit here and discover and that's what people believe is going on. They think that scientific institutions and universities and stuff are just a lot of people searching for truth.
Yes.
I mean, it's like 100-year-old notion that is still there.
Yeah. Yeah, so the difficulty you have is that institutionalized science, as it is now, is like trying to turn around the Titanic to avoid an iceberg. Good luck.
Yeah.
And this is why, in the past, a chap I knew, quite a good friend when I was working in England, pointed out that in the past, most of the big breakthroughs in science came from what he called eminent outsiders. And amongst those eminent outsiders was Faraday. So that kind of thing can't happen these days. A lot of the big names in the past wouldn't have got past the peer review system.
No.
Simply because they didn't have the credentials. Well, these days the credentials can actually work against you.
Yeah. No, that's so true. The age of the mad scientist, quote unquote, the free researching truth seeker, it's gone, but the image is lingering on in public consciousness. That's why people are supporting the institutions as a Catholic would support the church.
Yeah. And
that's being propagated in movies and media, and I say science journalism is a big culprit here.
Oh.
It's nothing but a propaganda tool by dimwits who doesn't even understand what they're reporting, is my view.
Of course. In fact, you'll often see that a NASA report is just printed verbatim in the newspapers. There is no critical aspect to modern science. In fact, Dr. Halton Arp, who I mentioned earlier, the modern day Galileo, said investigative journalism in science is dead, which is a huge mistake. If science, to the extent that science is an art, where are the art critics?
Yeah, good point. Are you familiar with, what's his name again? He suggested a science court.
Oh, yes, Tommy Gold, Professor Tommy Gold.
No, it's not him I'm referring to, but go on.
Oh, well, he was one who actually published his views on it. Now, he was one of these gadfly scientists who kept pricking, the ideas of the standard ideas and offering alternative solutions, and remarkably often he was right. But he said there should be a science court because if scientists had to present their ideas and ask for funding in front of a court of not their immediate peers but people who had scientific training but not in the discipline he's talking about, they would fail cross-examination in any court. And I agree with that, absolutely. I mean, if you could put Einstein in the dock, I'd be asking him to define mass and energy to begin with, and then ask him how he could do away with the ether and yet still have wave motion between a source and a sink.
Right. I'm trying to remember who it was. He's old emeritus. He suggested that to Science Court in order to solve the problem of science going astray.
That's right.
He's been a vocal critic in many things like the AIDS, AHV debate.
Oh, yes.
Oh, but I can't recall his name now. He's so famous, huge dissident. In fact, I want to interview him.
Yeah.
But,
that's one of
but so you believe...
You mentioned AIDS and that kind of biological research. The scientific magazines now are full of papers to do with biochemistry and so on. And it's been, a study was done a short while ago which pointed out that most of those papers, no one's replicated them to test them. And most of them would... actually cannot be replicated. In other words, the papers are wrong, and yet they are referred to by others as being the source of, part of their research as well.
Yeah. So there was this... sorry, go on.
Yeah, it becomes a kind of a vicious spiral downwards when that happens. And what people don't recognize is that the same thing is happening in the physical sciences.
Right. Yeah, that's the problem. We don't realize that's happening in physical too. We do know it goes on in the soft.
It usually only takes me a few minutes to scan a work and say, right, nope.
Right. Yeah, I know what you mean. But my immediate skepticism to a science court, although I get the point and I do, it will probably be an improvement. But I see the dangers of, someone has to be judges and juries, and those someone has to be human beings, and then we're back to the corruption.
Well, that is a problem, yes. And as one, I think it was Will Rogers said, common sense is very uncommon, and it requires common sense, knowledge of logic, and also the methods of argument.
Yeah, and the ability to recognize facts. I mean, you would have people who would be ideologically biased.
Oh, yes.
Some would have vested interests, material interests. Some would be prone to corruption. But
some of the best people you could get would be engineers, because they have to look at something and say, yes, I think that would work. Yep,
I agree. That is an advantage. But on the other hand, it's much better than today, because today it's like a secret. Is like a sect, a secret society sitting there and determining it.
Yes. Halton Arp called them equivalent to the medieval guilds.
Yeah. Or maybe even mafia, we could call them.
Or mafia, they've been called that too.
Well, let's hope that you can make your movement can create a push. It's correct to call it a movement, right? More than an organization, the EU.
Yes, my dear colleague and friend David Talbot said to me a few years ago, he said, do you realize we've become a movement?
And I hope we can contribute to that. You did mention a UK conference. What's that?
At Bath University, I think it's the July 6 and 7. You can find information and links to it from our thunderbolts.info website.
I hope we can get this show out before that. We will get it out to our subscribers, but to the public, I'll try, just so that they can get that little shout out.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I should mention is that Gaia TV in America had me over, and I did 2 days of interviews with them, and they've made a television series which is coming out episode by episode. They're up to episode 5 out of 7, and Gaia.com, you can find the Electric Universe on there. They've done quite a good job. Of course, if I'd been involved in doing the animations, I would have made them more accurate, but however, the impact, I think, is very good.
Interesting. What about, I do know you have a YouTube channel. I'm subscribing to that. So
that's on thunderbolts.info. There's a YouTube channel with our space news. There's a daily blog during the week by Stephen Smith, who has done an excellent job writing up news items from the Electric Universe point of view, and I do many of the space news on that at that website too.
you obviously have good equipment. You used to be. Do you do recordings yourself, or you just for interviews?
I do recordings of the space news and send the sound file to America, where David Talbot's son puts together the space news, and he and I lately have been doing it in interview style. But I've always been interested in sound and film and whatnot. In fact, I was an amateur filmmaker. That was my hobby.
Oh, okay.
And so I've got a Rode microphone, which they're very good mics.
Right. So do you have your own website?
I do, but it's more of a historical collection now, because most of my work is devoted to the thunderbolts.info website. But mine is holoscience, HOLO science.com.
As in holism?
As in holism, yes. In other words, it's the holistic cosmology.
Mm-hmm. I'm a supporter of that. So, but the main site to go to if people want to...
thunderbolts.info. That has all of the up-to-date research. It has videos of our conferences and other contributors on the space news and so on.
Is that the one organized by David Talbot?
Yes, that was initiated by David.
Mm. And he's into myths and stuff, mythology. Is that his forte?
He's a comparative mythologist. There was three in particular: Eduardo Cardona, a Canadian, and Ev Cochran, another American from Iowa.
Mm. I think I'll have one of those chaps on to discuss the mythical aspect of all this, because that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Ev Cochran.
And that's probably as subversive to religions as the electrical universe is to science.
Well, when you think about it, religion is not an answer to anything. It's the biggest question facing mankind.
It should be.
What gave rise to religions, and what were they about? What was it? What was that myth-making epoch about? Because it's never occurred since.
Right. Do you have published any books?
Yes, David Talbot and I published Thunderbolts of the Gods and The Electric Universe. We've shared everything. This is once again my idea of shared responsibility for all of this work. And I recognized in him a real dynamo in trying to get other people involved. He was much better at it than I am. Yeah, those are the two books. I'm actually in the process of organizing a new volume of The Electric Universe, which brings everything up to date, because it's only in recent years that I've managed to figure out gravity. It's always been the big puzzle at the top of the list. Mm-hmm. And I think I finally got it just a couple of years ago in one of my presentations at the 2017 annual conference. I presented The Long Path to Understanding Gravity.
Wow. Well, that you mentioned you also done some papers in the past.
Yes, the IEEE journal, and the topic was The Electrical Nature of Supernova 1987A. The books, by the way, can be found through the Thunderbolts website, and it goes to a website of one of our volunteers, and it's called Stickman on Stone. And when you read Thunderbolts of the Gods, you'll recognize what that means. Prehistoric images of petroglyphs and so on, the North American Indian rock carvings and so on, are all recognizable plasma forms. It gives an idea of the antiquity of the events. So Stickman on Stone, if you just Google that, you'll find the repository of books and other items which people might find interesting or useful.
So your studies are publicly available?
Yes, yes. Well, you can go to Amazon, but I mean, they just charge a fortune, because we found that they rip publishers like ours off. And so...
Of course. I mean, someone has to make Jeff Bezos rich, so, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the way we do things these days just has to change. But I think they're $27 US, which is quite reasonable considering they're big, full-color books.
Okay. Hey, I just recall the name of the science course guy. It's Dr. Henry Bauer. You probably know about him.
Oh, yes, I know him. Yeah, Henry Bauer.
Excellent guy.
Yes, he knows us too.
Oh, okay. Is he positive?
Yes, in a sense. He's looking at more general problems of science and skepticism and how science operates.
And he's also a proponent of the interdisciplinary requirement.
Yes. I think anyone with any common sense can see that this must be so. Yeah. Specialism just doesn't work in this case.
No. Well, not in terms of coming up with a paradigm valid for all, but it works if you're going to develop some gizmo. You see what I mean?
Well, that's applied science, and technology. And science hides behind technological advancement, which happens whether you understand what you're doing or not.
Exactly, and that's so annoying because those scientism guys, their big argument always, if you push them, it always ends up in, well, we developed computers and cars. In your universe, that wouldn't exist. That's supposed to prove their dogmatism. And yet, it's ludicrous.
And yet somebody's gone back and had a look and found that transistors were developed before quantum theory.
Right.
They've already found semiconductor activity in crystal sets, for instance, before quantum theory. And
do you know how far back it goes?
Well, the breakthroughs of the Faradays and Gausses and Webers and all the electromagnetic theorists of the 19th century laid the basis for the 20th century technology. There's nothing about the Large Hadron Collider that I can think of that relies on anything other than the electromagnetic laws that were formulated in the 19th century.
So is that whole project a waste of time?
Absolutely. Why would you think that the mass of an object has anything to do with some imaginary particle, which forms a kind of treacle? I mean, this is just the language.
But I think they are claiming they have succeeded in verifying.
No, they haven't.
Finds.
No, the whole premise under which that thing was built is invalid in the electric universe theory.
Can what they're playing with be dangerous?
Only for themselves. Black holes.
Yeah, but I mean, can they launch forces out of control?
No. The energies involved out in the universe are far greater than anything they can do.
Okay.
All they can do is waste money.
Right. Okay, well, that's good to know, because I was a bit spooked when someone talked about that they may be able to create black holes and whatnot.
Yes, well, black holes are a figment of a fevered Einsteinian imagination.
I guess it just goes to show that language is more important than we think, because...
Oh, yes. Yeah? Yes, absolutely.
And no wonder it was one of the big disciplines in antiquity, you know?
Yes.
People had to study stuff like rhetorics.
Yes, that's right.
And that's lost today. Well, Wal, it was an absolute pleasure conversing with you. I can see why people nagged us for so long to get you on.
Well, thanks, Al. I enjoyed the chat with you too.
That's good to know. So that means that if I invite you back, you'll come?
Sure.
That's great. Hey, I forgot to ask you one question, a quick one.
Yeah, okay.
Because you mentioned the Van Allen belt.
Yes.
Now, there's people claiming that people can't really pass it because we will be fried. What is the Van Allen belt in your understanding?
In a magnetized body like the Earth, when it is involved in an electric circuit and the current is being carried through a rarefied gas, which you could say is the space between us and the sun, the solar wind, it will form ring currents around that body equatorially, and equatorially in relation to the magnetic field. And, of course, that ring current holds energy, and the energy is in the motion of those charged particles, which can reach speeds which are not which are inimical to any long-term existence for living systems. In other words, astronauts on their way to the moon don't want to linger in those regions too long, because you can have electrons and protons at millions of electron volts. Perhaps.
So they get fried?
Eventually, yes. Yeah, so it's the kind of environment you don't want to stay for any length of time.
But it's fully possible to pass it quickly?
Oh, yes, yeah. You just get a few X-rays worth of radiation dose on the way through, that's all.
I see.
In fact, the trip to the moon and back, those guys must have had lifetimes worth of chest X-rays.
But do we know if any of these astronauts who went out to space has died of cancer and stuff like that?
I don't know. I don't know if anyone has done a study. I'm sure they've been followed up medically, but I haven't read any reports of that.
I mean, people who work with
the one thing it does change is their attitude towards life on Earth. Those who have left Earth suddenly realize what it means to be separated from the Earth.
Right. Well, even people working in dentists' office gets cancer. There was a big fight here in our country about technicians or whatever they call those who do the X-rays.
Yes.
They try to get their rights.
There's a lot to be learned yet by biologists about the electrical nature of life. When they do so, they may change their mind about some things they do.
So that's what you guys have got going for you, is that even if they killed off all of you, it would fight its way back as long as we're studying reality, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The truth will out.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I think that sums it up. Anything you want to add?
Nope. I think I need a toilet break.
Yeah. Okay, let's let the body get its due.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks a lot. I'll send you a link when it's out, and you can promote it to your folks.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's our first program on the electrical universe. But like I said in the show, we will make a follow-up where we will go into the catastrophism. I feel that deserves its own show. It's a huge subject in itself, and I wouldn't do that any service or the topic of today if we crammed all of that into one show. So look out for a future show with Wall. I'm gonna end this program today reading you some relevant quotes, but first let me tell you a true story. We've lost 8,000, I think it was, subscribers, but not in a natural way. You probably heard the rumors. People are being unsubscribed from independent channels and force subscribed to mainstream channels. So even the mainstream independent channels are onto this bad plot now. It's simply a matter of the legacy media singling out YouTube as a survival for them, they think, because papers and TV channels are losing so much customers, viewers, listeners, that online has surpassed them long ago. And the advertisement industry has caught up to it, but have been reluctant to adjust to the new media, because who owns the advertisement companies? Basically the same who run the old stream media. So what they did, they bought, well, they already controlled Google, and Google has bought YouTube. So it's all a transitioning. They can't just boot everything out at once. Then they would lose all the viewers, listeners, you guys. Because at the end of the day, it's a battle about your attention. So there have slowly, and I've been onto this as my regular listeners knows. I've been talking about this before it was common knowledge, but now it's out there in the open, everybody can see. So we've had several apocalypse, we've had several rewritings of the algorithm, we've had this increasing censorship, first they came for Alex Jones, etc. And we've even had a rewriting of the copyright laws. If you look into that, we may have a show on it, but there's already good shows about it. That whole scheme is hand in glove to facilitate this new process. They won't be happy until all free users are refrained from using the web. They want the web to be like a huge big commercial. McDonald's, Amazon, only for the consumer, just to purchase, just to consume, but not to create. That's the big problem that social media has illustrated since it took off. And it's not a matter of fair fight, it's not a matter of free market or real competition, it's a matter of rigging the game and forcing people out. And one of those details in that big process is for you guys to be unsubscribed and then subscribed. And of course, not just our channel. It happens across the board. And no, it's not a plot against the right wing, as many people think. It's basically independent versus corporate. So it doesn't matter where on the political spectrum you are, left, right. It doesn't matter if you go against their main holy cows. Like for example, try having a anti-war show and see where that brings you. It doesn't matter your perspective as long as it goes against the huge industry. And that's how it is across the board. Some topics hasn't been touched yet, like it seems that UFOs and stuff like that can be covered, but it's obviously just a matter of time until they crack down on all kinds of independent, non-mainstream. So for our own sake, we see that spiritual shows so far are not being demonetized, but and I'm going to be curious to see how they will treat this. This is like a scientific topic, so maybe it will pass. Although it's system critical. But at the end of the day, the real power remains with you guys. So make sure that you are subscribed to us and also click the bell. As everybody says, you probably heard every channel out there say this. But do it, check it. We would hate to lose more. And our growth is stifled almost. So they don't give exposure to independent media as they used to, and so and if you take a look at the right side of our YouTube video, it used to be like lots of Forum Borealis shows recommended at our own shows. Now it's like one, and the rest is divided between mainstream and the rest topic related. So if you want to support us, it's not just about donating and sharing our shows. Sharing goes a long way, by the way, to influence the algorithm, but it's also important that you subscribe and click the bell so you stay in the loop. I don't know why they distinguish between subscribing and clicking the bell, because obviously if you subscribe you want to be updated, right? But no, if you subscribe without clicking the bell you won't get updates. So check that, do that, and help us grow. And the more subscribers we have, the better we will be faring, and the more exposure we will get. Now to the quotes. The brilliant genius that was Michael Faraday said, "Lectures which really teach will never be popular. Lectures which are popular will never really teach." And he said, "I happen to have discovered a direct relation between magnetism and light, also electricity and light, and the field it opens is so large and I think rich." Another brilliant fellow, William John Rankine, I'm not sure how you pronounce that name in English, said, The words theory and practice are contrasted and placed in opposition as denoting two mutually conflicting and mutually inconsistent ideas. This fallacy, based on a double system of natural laws, retarded for centuries the development of physical science, notably mechanics. And he said, discrepancy between theory and practice, which in sound physical and mechanical science is a delusion, has a real existence in the minds of men, and that fallacy, though rejected by their judgment, continues to exert an influence over their acts. Edward Leadskalnin, another name I probably mangled there, the guy behind the coral castle phenomenon, he said, we receive an education in the schools from books. All those books that people became educated from 25 years ago are wrong now. And those that are good now will be wrong again 25 years from now. So if they are wrong then, they are also wrong now. And the one who is educated from the wrong books is not educated. He is misled. All books that are written are wrong. The one who is not educated cannot write a book, and the one who is educated is really not educated, but he is misled, and the one who is misled cannot write a book which is correct. And he said, magnetic current is the same as electric current. Current is actually the wrong expression. Really, it is not one current. There are two currents. One current is composed of North Pole individual magnets in concentrated streams, and the other is composed of South Pole individual magnets in concentrated streams. And they are running one stream against the other stream in whirling screw-like fashion and with high speed. He also said, the Earth itself is a great big magnet. And speaking of magnets, Victor Schauberger said, the majority believes that everything hard to comprehend must be very profound. This is incorrect. What is hard to understand is what is immature, unclear, and often false. The highest wisdom is simple and passes through the brain directly into the heart. Similar genius Walter Russell said, the electric energy which motivates us is not within our bodies at all. It is a part of the universal supply which flows through us from the universal source with an intensity set by our desires and our will. And finally, Nikola Tesla said, Einstein's relativity work is a magnificent mathematical garb which fascinates, dazzles, and makes people blind to the underlying errors. The theory is like a beggar clothed in purple, whom ignorant people take for a king. Its exponents are brilliant men, but they are metaphysicists rather than scientists. And, he said, today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. And that's it for today. Thank you for the attention and your support. Your host has been Al, remaining yours sincerely. Until next time. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?